Today we have on this episode of the Account Coker Report, we have James Heathers. It's a pleasure to have him. James, welcome.
A pleasure to have him back, sir.
Yes, this is the second time. Now James is now different from his last time when he was here. He is now Chief Scientific Officer at Cypher Skin. He's no longer toiling away in some basement of some lab in academia somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely not. I'm no longer am I toiling away doing science in a literal basement. I'm now toiling away doing science at the fourth floor of a building, and if I don't get it right, people yell at me.
How is it? How's the transition been?
Um, Hard question. Easier for me probably than a lot of other people because I went from a job where I did science in the research sense, as people would typically understand it, and had a reasonable degree of self-determination, and worked with a small group of people. And then I went to a job where I did exactly the same thing, more or less. The difference is in the pace and the strategy, and obviously everything else that comes along with being an officer of a company rather than just a research scientist. That part is different, but a lot of the day-to-day stuff is remarkably similar. So easier for me than other people. Also, look, to be honest, I mean, I've talked about this before in public. I spent a very long time getting ready, sort of both from a mental perspective and from a skills perspective, to have a plan B. I didn't suddenly one day go, oh, a plague. What a hassle. I guess I'll do something else. It was more a fact of this was always a possibility, and the opportunity presented itself at the right time, and I had to think very hard about whether to push the button. I'm a big fan of buttons that are pushed the whole way to the bottom. So I didn't so much as push it as took the hammer fist and went right, bang, done. And vaulted right out early on in the plague. So when was the decision made? Probably June last year. So I've had 18 months-ish of, because, it takes a little while to get set up. You have these initial conversations and you make a decision and you make a transition. So 18 months so far of being a corporate gentleman.
Excellent. So the move from the public sphere to the private sphere. You used to do. I mean, you're a big time. Would it be fair to say you're a big time analytic guy? Correct.
Well, I've met big time data analytic people, and in general, they handle different sorts of things than I do. Like the projects that they have are not more substantive as much as more substantial. I guess,
so deciding on it gets to the point that you made recently in a Atlantic piece that you wrote about ivermectin. And you used ivermectin, the story of ivermectin that has at this point consumed I don't know how much airtime and
most of it.
You used the ivermectin, the quality of the ivermectin data to not just bang ivermectin, but to talk about the larger quality of data science and how one figures out whether something is really true or not when it comes to an effect, right? So, I thought it was a really, really nice piece. And you, of course, for those who don't know, James, you've long been one of a merry band of crusaders for better data science and kind of looking not just at the paper and what it says and analyzing the paper, but actually looking behind that, right? One step behind to say, well, is what has been written on the paper in terms of the actual data, does it make sense? Does it comport with reality? And I know you've had some tools and stuff that you've used to try to figure that stuff out. And ivermectin, in some senses, was given all the controversy about ivermectin and the fact that there's some pretty strong beliefs on either side. You looked at a number of the randomized control trials that have been done, and what did you find?
Um, well, in general, I think it's true to say that the most famous, outlandishly successful RCTs were either manifestly inaccurate to the point where they should be ignored or straight up fake. And which gives me absolutely no pleasure whatsoever to say, because this is it used to be that, like, this other work that I do that is only somewhat related to what we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so. It used to be more fun because the stakes were a lot lower. It's fun to be able to retrofit a table of funny looking p values and try and figure out like what's happening with the man behind the curtain. These sort of Wizard of Oz problems. It was sort of like high stakes Sudoku for me for a very long time. And when it comes to preprints and poorly published papers that immediately affect global health policy, it makes me a lot more serious and bad tempered about the whole thing. And the fact that any of this was possible in the first place, that it was possible for a literature to grow up into having this position, and there was never any authoritative body anywhere that synthesized the whole thing, all the things that people were talking about all the time at sort of digital speed. Nothing ever managed to do that and say the authoritative position is we can't trust this. Now, obviously, I mean, Cochrane had a position on it. There were lots of different papers from fancy people that had positions on it. Governments, public health services had positions on it, but they weren't engaging. And it shouldn't be a group of scruffy volunteers who has to point out that there are gigantic and obvious problems with these studies, right? Because here's the thing. I have no small amount of empathy for people who read studies that are very poorly constructed and looked at them and took them at face value, because that's literally what the vast majority of scientists and clinicians and researchers do anyway. Many of these things were peer reviewed by people who have more local knowledge than I do, and didn't manage to point out the fact that they were wildly implausible on the basis of the data. Right. So when we have a group of people who believe very strongly in something, and they said, you know what, I've actually read the evidence, they may have. They may well have. It's hard to sort of go, well, they didn't read it as well as me, so, you know, fuck them. What a bunch of dupes. No, right. It doesn't work like that. We have this is a broader problem where there is absolutely no collective quality control when it comes to the conversations that happen around individual topics like this.
Right. So there were 30 some RCTs, right? You looked through as many as you could,
it's honestly,
or maybe more.
It's impossible to know. People right. Like I had people write to me on the internet and go, well, okay, well, you said there's 5 out of 30 or something. It's like, but you don't understand. Some of these are published as just a protocol. Some things were registered but never finished. Right. Some things were described as RCTs but weren't really actually RCTs. They're sort of like quasi-observational whatevers. They're published all over the world. They're registered in different places. Some of them are pre-printed. Some of them are pre-printed and then published, and they change along the way. Some of them end up being actually published. So what are the numbers? I don't know, and you don't either.
The point you bring up, which is very salient. The point you bring up is very salient, though, is that this is very much a wider problem, right? The question is, if you picked something else, right? If you picked, I don't know, something else that we do commonly, say Tamiflu for the flu, would we run into the same problems as we're running into with ivermectin, or do you think there's something unique about ivermectin? Do you think?
Great question. So here's the distinction that I'm comfortable making, and then I'll tell you what I don't know after that. People are treating this literature, sometimes when they talk about it, they're treating this literature on this drug in this context as this is the bad thing that happened, and thank God the bad thing doesn't happen elsewhere. I think that's bullshit. and that everything else exists on a continuum where it is more similar, where many other situations, many other drugs, many other areas of research are more similar to this than other people are comfortable admitting. It is a bad case for the obvious reason that the really big serious RCTs with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of downloads and views and many, many citations since even the beginning of the plague 18 months ago, it is the case where those really big things, those really big statements and papers were like egregiously bad. Yes, but it doesn't make it a difference in kind. It is a difference in degree. And I get to say this because I have read many good journals publishing a good paper on what's allegedly a good device and thought, I have absolutely no faith in this whatsoever. Now, right. In many respects, what saves that is a lot of the time it's more sophisticated. Yeah. So if you read like the results of something, there's a thing that's actually in. I wish I could tell you about this, but all three of us will get sued back into the Stone Age. Suffice to say, it's a device. It went through a clinical trial. It was measuring a cardiovascular feature. The results that it provided were allegedly good enough to do something diagnostic. It was approved for use. And I think the company raised a lot of money on the back of this particular device. And I'm about 98% convinced that this trial data is cooked.
Right.
But one, I can't prove it. Two, there's a 0% chance that this data is not commercial in confidence. So there's no point even asking for it. They'll tell me to pound sand and go away. It is not right. Possible, and I have no governmental or legal recourse to ever be able to get it.
Right.
So if that's possible in the fanciest world, we are simply talking about we are simply talking about two things that are the same in kind. It's not the disaster of ivermectin and everything else being just fine. It's a matter that like this is a little bit dumber and a little bit more dangerous and a little bit worse than many other things. But that small distinction has some really gigantic consequences right now. I hope I've articulated that correctly, because that is a key question, and one of the reasons that I wrote that article in the first place.
Yeah, no, I'm going to have you articulate it more, because you describe the problem. The problem that you're describing is false data in the literature, right? Essentially, and so and you don't know where all these minefields are kind of laid, correct? Because as you're saying, like, I mean, I'm a cardiologist. Michelle's a cardiologist. We can maybe pick out some of the minefields in our areas. Some of our John Mandrola, for instance, is a guy who writes a lot about within cardiology about things you're seeing. And I can tell you right now, in use in intensive care units all over the place are physiological monitoring devices that have been sold to the ICU physicians. They are using it willy-nilly, and I have. One of the things is literally based on like data in elephants or something, and fluid shifts or some ridiculous thing when I last looked. But so what it comes down to is that you generally, it requires a ton of local knowledge to try to sort out what's true and what's real. So it goes well beyond reading a paper, as you're pointing out, but it even goes well beyond reading a paper and being like, oh, this clearly this stuff is made up. It speaks to a matter of faith. So how or how I know what's true or not, in large part comes down to, do I trust the person who's telling me these things or not? So when it comes to ivermectin, right? I wrote a not as concise and good piece as you did. I wrote a piece in the healthcare blog talking about not necessarily saying ivermectin is there's no, I can't at all see why ivermectin will work. The piece more was framed as, when you have something like COVID, which results in a large percentage of people improving, regardless of what it is you do, right? That sets up the stage for a lot of snake oil, and it's so vitamin D, turmeric, cumin. I mean, you name it. And if you take a disease that has, pretty high survival rate, in general, you're going to see lots of these things kind of crop up. And then the
Yeah.
question is going to become, well, how the heck do we figure out whether or not this is working on? So now
There's no
yeah.
homeopathic treatments for aortic dissection, are there?
Right, exactly.
Right.
You're
So
exactly right. Exactly. So that's why you don't really have this as much of a problem when you're dealing with aortic dissection or somebody in the midst of having a ST elevation MI, right? It's not like nobody's running around like selling turmeric to those people, right? But for a growing hair analysis,
the circumstances of any given what
right,
something is,
right,
how many people have it, what the recovery
yeah,
trajectory looks like,
yeah,
all of this forms a context.
right,
And some of these contexts
right,
are very good
right.
at supporting the ability to build false narratives.
Yes,
And
yes,
that applies equally to medication where tens of millions of dollars have been spent on its development
right.
and some shit we found in the bathroom cabinet.
No question. So this is the point I'm coming to. Then, Michelle, you're on. So you have folks, and what gives me a little bit of pause is that you have folks that are kind of in the bowels of COVID, right? These are a lot of ICU physicians. So the folks that are the ones that are, I don't know all of them, but I know Paul Merrick. Paul Merrick, by the way, is a guy who's a, respected ICU physician who, I mean, as a fellow, would quote his hypertensive urgency review that he wrote because I thought it was so good. His lectures on fluid shifts and fluid management, just really, really good. These are just fundamental underlying physiologic things. Then, then came like the vitamin C years and vitamin C for sepsis. And anyway, and now, but my point is he's a critical care intensivist who's on the front lines. Pierre Corey also on the front lines. And then they have a whole other group of folks that are also saying that and acknowledging that, you can be fooled by this disease, right? I'm a little surprised to see a bunch of ICU physicians who aren't like me or aren't like a lot of physicians sitting on the outpatient. I'm in critical care units, but on the cardiac side, I'm not in the medical ICU. So I'm rarely primarily responsible for COVID patients, but I'm usually consulting on COVID patients. So I'm seeing them. But anyway, my point is, they're kind of in the prime driver's seat. I'm a little surprised that they would get this so wrong, James. So even if the data is rife with issues, which it is in many different topics that we could delve into, does it make you a little nervous about coming out? Not that you have done that, but in general for people who take a stance that's very against the prescription for ivermectin in certain settings. It's a long-winded question.
Okay.
James, before you answer, I should have done this maybe earlier. For the audience, I want to provide a little bit of the context for this ivermectin, or just recap a little bit the highlights of how it played out during the pandemic, right? So, I mean, as far as I understand it, there was so the pandemic. You're right. The pandemic comes. People are locked down. There's large degree of anxiety everywhere across the board, and then there are some papers that are published that demonstrate some in vitro, so sort of some plausible mechanism for this particular medication to be used in SARS-CoV-2. There are some other clinical observations that are made, and then very quickly there's a bunch of clinical trials, and the poor quality of those clinical trials was in a way recognized, but it was excused as being, well, this is the best we can do in this context and whatnot. And part of the narrative was, primarily from the folks that Anish just mentioned, was, it has a great safety profile. We don't know, but this is the best we can do when it's, during wartime or during this sort of a catastrophe situation. This is the best you can do, and it doesn't hurt, and why not? And that was mixed in. It was a strange mixture of, on the one hand, a strong belief that it worked, and on the other hand, a disclaimer that it was based on imperfect data, and it doesn't hurt, and we should try it. So that was the context. So within that, people took sides very quickly before your work, right? Before you came up with your work and your colleagues, and clearly showed some major problems with these trials. People took sides, either for or against. And I think that's what Anish is alluding to, or trying to, move the conversation towards, is how do we come to form our opinions on these things, when it's perhaps unrealistic to subject every clinical trial or every claim to the kind of rigorous, maybe not. I mean, in the case of ivermectin, it was pretty flagrant what you did, but nevertheless, you did it. Not many people do it. You have a keen eye. Your team has developed a method to analyze the data on these papers, and so that's the conundrum that I think we're
it comes down to faith,
right?
And clearly there's
well, I'm not sure it's just faith. Yeah. So I think we could talk about that,
okay.
But I can't say.
No. So faith in the research teams, and no. So I'll go back to James. James,
right.
You have Pierre Court. You have these ICU physicians that have been taking care of ICU patients. If they feel strongly that this works, how do we go about? What should we do? Should we restrict them from prescribing it? Like, what's the how do we?
You're trying to drag me way out of my lane by my ears.
Yeah, no, I think before we do that, I think
I've never prescribed anything to anyone in my life.
Yeah, I know. Meaning, what should the basis, as a data science guy, what should the basis be for us to take a very strong position to say, hey, this person should not be doing this?
Well, I'll tell you what would stop the whole thing its tracks.
Yeah.
Right? Some official body somewhere, someone in some government, should get someone like me to help people like you a year sooner. Because what you're describing, when you're talking about how, well, we have imperfect information, there's only so much that we can get at the time. And then we have a question more of how do we balance the kind of medical expedience, and how do we regard both the short and the long run ethics of this situation, right? Because if we give it to people, this drug has an excellent safety profile. It's prescribed all over the world. It's like billions of roundworms have died at its hand. We know how it works. It does very well, right? It's a ripper drug. And in the short term, if we're talking about how well does it do, the answer is, if it doesn't hurt people, we have a very different ethical environment than when we run that situation for the next 9 months and we start to rely on it in favor of other options. When these things start to fill out the medical space and we start to treat it as if it was not simply prospective, but because we've had enough time basically to fool ourselves so far that it changes how we understand how we set broader policies when we're talking about stopping people from getting sick in the first place. It changes the behavioral profile of people who think that they are, they've got a big horse derringer in the corner. And, I've not, there's this, the whole thing about the sort of horse deworm. I mean, this is the thing that scientists have a tremendous amount of difficulty admitting. It's the same shit in there. The same antibiotics that you give your parakeet are very, very, very similar to yours. You're not supposed to take them, and there are risks associated with veterinary products, a little bit really because of the way that they're constructed, but usually because of the dosing and the fact that you're just not supposed to get drugs out of a drench pump, right? But if you have that, and then you say, well, I'm protected now. You could have hundreds of thousands or millions of people who will change their behavior, because my behavior changed 2 weeks after my second Pfizer shot. Yeah. And I think it changed again after my booster recently, because I considered the risk profile to be different. Now there's things that people say, well, come out to the pub. Can we sit outside? Yes. Cool. We're going. I have no sort of anxiety about that anymore. Maybe. Yeah, but maybe a little bit.
But so, how are you coming to those decisions? Like, and I'm not saying they're not, they're bad. They're not good decisions. But you've made a lot of changes, right? You wrote a Medium piece about all the things that you've done, right, over the year to try to avoid COVID, and you successfully avoided it prior to the prior to the jabs, and and you went through in some detail on the piece in terms of what you did, which seems like reasonable, rational stuff, right? Avoid crowded spaces, don't wait around in poorly ventilated spaces, check in the bags and wait a bit, or use the bathroom in a terminal that's not being used. Now, and then you talked about how many masks you wear and whatnot. So, but all of those things are zero issues again with any of that. But none of that is based on some very super high level of evidentiary stuff, right? Meaning,
no, it's not based on medical evidence at all. It's based on we cannot. I find it really weird sometimes in conversations, not this one, but ones that are related to this, where we get to sort of push the biophysics away.
Right.
Yeah. If you've got a terminal with 1,000 people in it, and then you've got a terminal with 6 people in it, the biophysics of people breathing in and out, and the fact that you can see that the air conditioning systems dictate that there is a risk difference. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's minuscule or enormous, but there was a period of time where I simply made up my mind to add everything on the basis of, I mean, you've got presumably you've got kind of an inverse square law when it comes to how much external space has been in there internally with someone in the first place.
Right.
And I stuck that all together in a big bucket and took every precaution that was possible. And honestly, look, at the end of the day, it didn't wreck my life up that much.
Right. Yeah, but clearly there's people with different experiences, different. I obviously was in a hospital every day through the pandemic and whatnot, and everyone is going to come up with some different type of thing that they feel based on bioplausibility or whatnot that they're going to do. The issue is, of course, in this case, you have a bunch of physicians that are critical care physicians. The ones that are championing are critical care physicians who feel very strongly, almost as strongly as you feel about. And I know it may seem irrational to you, but to them it seemed, the rest of us seem irrational.
No, I think they've probably had incredibly powerful lived experiences that they are continuously filtering through their preconceptions. See, the thing is, I have something that they don't.
Yeah, what's that?
I have conclusive mathematical evidence that the best pieces of the evidentiary process here either didn't happen or happened so wrong that they're completely uninformative.
Just to be clear, they relied. I mean, those critical care doctors relied on those RCTs to make their claims. I mean, clearly they were citing those studies from Egypt and elsewhere as supporting their position.
Yeah, of course. But there is a difference. This is something that people continuously miss. Scientists, researchers, academics, doctors, epidemiologists fight like cats all the time about, a lot of the time, decisions that come down to, as the things that we're talking about, a matter of experience, a matter of perspective, a matter of how an ethical position changes over time. And you can have people who look at exactly the same evidence and come up with different conclusions. Both of them are very clever. Both of them are acting in good faith. And they'll look at the same thing and they'll disagree with each other. Right. Now, I'm less interested in those fights sometimes. I have my own perspective, but in general, I don't bother people with them. Because when we're saying something's wrong, we're not talking about, well, if you come up with some cockamamie explanation for how the numbers are the way they are, it's not that. We're talking about the possibility of that existing as it's described is like 1 in 17 quadrillion, or that is mathematically impossible, or that is practically impossible, or you've published 2 versions of the same data and they don't agree with each other and they're not the same thing. We're talking about an absolute description of, can it exist as described or not?
Right.
And when you come up with not, you have a very powerful piece of information, which is not available to interpretation, because the absolute best thing you can say about it is, in this very important study with this very powerful amount of people, the people who wrote this paper are completely incapable of assembling the information in a way where it can be trustworthy and accurate. Maybe it all exists, maybe it did, and that's the best possible outcome. is that the researchers are too dumb to add up. Right?
So yeah, you're absolutely
and
correct.
it goes from that all
Right.
the way through to
Right.
all the way
Right.
through to that's the best possible outcome. The worst possible outcome is they've literally made all of this shit up from scratch because, well, actually for a very venal kind of reason. There's a lot of attention in it, and they thought they could become famous. And someone asked them nicely, they thought it was a good idea. And there's a lot of academic cultures and academic journals, frankly, which do not consider strong empirical evidence to be part of the thing. They just publish stuff in a very kind of cargo cult mentality, which is the fact, they're building paper planes and hoping they fly.
I think the issue is that they did not come to their conclusions. Their practice has not been dictated by what the paper in Egypt or Bangladesh said, right?
When you say you're talking about the critical care doctors, right?
I'm talking about the group of doctors that feel very strongly, right? They're not practicing that way because of the Egyptian RCT. They believe it because of their experiences, and then they look to the research to come up with stuff that confirms underlying bias.
I mean, I don't think you can separate it. I mean, I think for them, the way I read what they're saying, it's sort of a package deal, meaning they have their experience, they looked at the data, there's in vitro studies and whatnot, and they make a claim on the basis of the totality.
But they're not swayed by the fact that there were 5 RCTs. They'll say, well, James is pointing out that if James took 30 other RCTs of stents, he would find that stent that we should not be putting stents in. So that's what they would say. They would say, no. Okay, yes, they're problematic, but we still believe it. And the reason they're doing it is because they have these super strong priors from their lived experiences, which makes the whole thing super difficult to ever actually come to some type of
so how do you not become a nihilistic, right? And say there's no way to. It's just everybody's opinion at the end of the day. And Anish, I mean, that's a question for you.
Right. No, I think that's why it comes
down to. And then what do you base your trust? If you say your trust, on what basis do you trust people, right? I mean, if you trust people who now you think have poor judgment based on the work that James did, or I mean, did you not, Anish? Well, even before James' work, published his work in the Atlantic, or did you not yourself have a different opinion about ivermectin? I mean, I did too, right? I mean, both of us were skeptical of ivermectin. And for what reason? For what are the reasons why you're skeptical?
Because but again, where I came from in terms of where my prior was built on was that I saw a ton of folks with COVID, and I saw a ton of folks with COVID on the outpatient side. I saw fewer on the inpatient side. I wasn't in New York City. I was in Philadelphia, which had a relatively smaller outbreak, and it was a smaller surge in that spring of 2020. And of course, ivermectin was not, at least here, was not being used significant amount. On the outpatient side, it certainly wasn't used, and we were inundated with calls on the outpatient side because I run a small primary care practice in Philadelphia, and you know what? I didn't give the vast majority of them anything. Vitamin D, ventilation, etc. And the vast majority of them got better. So when someone then comes out and says, well, if you give ivermectin, you're going to drastically reduce what's happening. Again, given my experience, I was like, well, I don't really see it. I mean, I'm willing to believe it if you can show me something else. But so that's where I kind of come from. And I'm a little nervous, honestly, that maybe we're missing something that the critical care folks are seeing, because but I don't know, so it's still up in the air. And
yeah,
then, of course,
you should be nervous about that. You should. There should the whole idea that that something's wrong as a study does not in any way preclude the central hypothesis from being true.
Right.
It precludes the study from being accurate.
Right.
Full stop. End of story. But I mean, do you know who Bertrand Russell is, right?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Okay, so he was at a lecture once, and some woman stood up and screamed at him, like, Lord Russell, what would you say when you stand before the seat of God? And he said something. I'll butcher the quote, but he said basically something like, "Sorry, big lad, but you didn't give us enough evidence." And there is a strong parallel here. And if the whole thing turned out to work tomorrow, I'd be delighted.
Yeah.
because you could go around and give it to people. We've got buckets of the stuff. If there was really good, strong evidence that everything was fine, everyone who said all of these studies are wrong would be kind of like, well, I mean, the studies were still wrong, but there's good evidence of it now. There's evidence that we can trust that's properly performed. It doesn't have any problems. It seems to be correct. The people who are talking about it don't seem to have any vested interest. They're just trying to solve the, like, you mash all that together and then you go, well, that's a win, isn't it?
Yeah.
For all the sick people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But the whole conversation, this is a conversation we've been having since the beginning. Honestly, it speaks to the power of lived experiences and how difficult it is to like depart from those lived experiences, right? James, again, the Medium piece you wrote about your kind of rundown of the pandemic, right? You spoke a lot about in the latter half about how part of the reason you think things got screwed up is because we didn't see the ravages of the pandemic, correct? Like the deaths were numbers. The deaths were not, you didn't see people dying. You didn't see people throwing up. You didn't see people, on ventilators. And, that was kind of masked, if you will, for large swaths of the public, correct? That I'm capturing your thesis reasonably well.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So again, but you felt that, look, for you as a data guy, right? When you see that number, that's the images that crop into your mind. Whereas for others, it may not, right?
Yeah.
So, but then of course the other kind of wrinkle or question then is that there are many physicians, of course, that didn't agree with, say, what policies we should have undertaken. I don't think anyone thinks that anyone did a good job, but say folks that were not for locking down and wanted focused protection. There's the economists and physicians and from fairly credentialed places as well that came out and signed this the Great Barrington Declaration, which you spoke in not so high terms about. But is it the case that what is it about their lived experiences, James, that's different than yours that results in this, completely different conclusion, if you will?
Well, when you're asking me to predict like the kind of the life and times of people who would participate in a document like that, I can only speculate. I don't know these people, and I'm certain that they don't know me, with whatever Z-grade notoriety I carry around these days. I would imagine, and I think this happened for a lot of people. I would imagine that there are plenty of people who are setting policies and sitting on panels and making large decisions about how models interact with data, who have simply had a position for a very long time where they have been rewarded through their careers for being vaguely impressive and authoritative and somewhat controversial. And they continually put themselves in an intellectual position where they feel like they are rewarded for occupying a certain space in the discourse around something. And if you can't get over yourself when you do something like that, you retreat to this kind of Stalinistic perspectives of one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And you start thinking about, well, let's just think about the broader mechanics of this. And then let's stick it together in a way where people feel like it's vaguely outlandish, but it makes sense. And there are a lot of people who write popular science books, people who have large positions within the kind of digital sphere, who consider themselves to be authoritative and sometimes have positions that go along with that authority, that support it. There are a lot of people who come from the position of, I need a fresh take, where everything that they say is basically one long psychic continuation of their own personal relevance. And the reason that I've formed that opinion is being in contact with lots and lots and lots of people like this over a very long period of time at a lot of different levels. I think they have been incentivized by an academic slash research scientific culture that rewards them for occupying a certain space. And when that happens, it's very dangerous where you are thinking about your position on an argument in terms of what does it mean for your brand, your identity, yourself. And all of this is rampantly speculative. But just think, look, where does that come from? If you're talking about someone who's forming policy in a room, they're looking essentially at models. So data is coming in, they're reading dashboards, they're aggregating stuff, or they're making their research assistants do it for them, and they're thinking about how do I put this together? How do I put this together? This very open-ended question: how do I put it together? The answer to that for a lot of people is ideological. And I don't, in many respects, I don't have positions like that. I'm not interested in anything else except what the trenches can tell you, right? The individual pieces themselves, right? Do you know who Michael Burry is?
I've heard of him. Who is he? Remind me. I'm sure.
Oh, he's the guy who shorted the U.S. housing market before the crash and made a lot of money. He was a doctor, and then he became an investor. Now, if you watch the film The Big Short, yes. there's a great scene where he says he wants to short the housing market, and someone said, "Well, the housing market's all based on mortgage bonds," and he said, "I read the mortgages; they're crap."
Right.
And the reply from whoever he was talking to was basically, "No one reads the mortgages. Like you look at the bond, you look at the value, you look at the valuation, you look at the trend. It's in the data of what the bond's actually doing." He goes, "No, I went and read the details. This person has not enough income to support this, and they're putting down a third mortgage on a different house because the housing market is going to keep growing forever, and they'll give you a mortgage for just about anything." And this guy went granular, and that's why he knew. Now I don't know how much of that is the film and how much of it is accurate, but I would bet that there is a great deal of truth to how that particular piece of the narrative played out. And that's one of the reasons is that you can cling very hard to, when it comes to forming your opinion, you can cling very hard to the granular details because you know what the inconsistencies will always mean. It's one of the very few things that you can lean on. And if you reason from there, I am absolutely, there's 8 papers on this thing. I'm 100% certain that 5 of them are garbage.
Right.
You can start there. It'll help.
Yeah. But this idea that if you just get more granular, that we will get to the answer that we want or we need. No, we want the one we should have, because that's the truth. Is it not? You're talking about a very small thing in terms of what we discussed was ivermectin, right? A tiny piece of like this massive COVID puzzle that encompasses economic policy, long-term effects, etc. Mm-hmm. Is it the case? And you're saying that one group may be driven ideologically and maybe by brand, etc. What we witnessed over the last 18 months, now that we're sitting on, who knows? I'm scared to say the end. It's never going to be the end, but we're sitting on some, whatever part of the journey. Does it not seem like these were competing ideologies? Like there was an ideology that came from the establishment public health that focused on how do we get COVID down, regardless of what everything else is, and that isn't that, and that's not wrong per se, but that's one ideology, right? 18 months now down, from when this started, you have schools that have, just take one thing, you have schools that have been closed in many places for a massive amount of time, and of course you have the whole thing.
You have 2 competing methods of managing the risks when you don't know what the risks are.
Right.
In general, you end up with maximalists on one side. And what people who think of themselves as reasonableists on the other, and then it comes down to the best information that you have about the risk and how you congenitally approach a problem like that.
Right. So is that really a data? Is that something that the data can answer for you? getting back to what we started off initially in terms of limits to data.
Well,
How do we?
it can't
Because some people
for me.
some people
There's,
go, yeah, some people go base jumping, some people smoke, some people, how do we? Where's it? How does it? The data doesn't. How does the data fit into this? Then it just becomes about competing values, and is one value going to imprint itself on, on the entire populace?
Well, I think the most sensible thing I can say about how all this fits together is the fact that, in many respects, I've spent the last year and a half not thinking about the plague, but learning to run a company, which is not particularly straightforward. But more than that, there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty early on, and it persisted for a very long period of time. And if you go back and look at things that I wrote for money, or things that I wrote for myself, or even shit that I've talked on social media, there was an enormous gap of me having an opinion. And that enormous gap where I probably could have, if I wanted to be famous, have filled the intervening space full of opinions that people would have taken seriously, because there are people in the world who will take me seriously if I'm talking about something that is supposed to be a data-driven problem. There's a reasonable community of people who would take my opinion seriously. So I kept my fucking mouth shut for a very long period of time, and was very happy that I didn't work in a public health context where I had to make decisions like this. There's a point, especially, look, because I'm not an epidemiologist. I have never worked in public health, and I do not envy the position that people have to take when they have to make a decision about something like that. And I would sincerely, there's a whole world of people who think I'm a loudmouth, except I'm only a loudmouth when I'm talking. People very rarely notice the times when you're quiet.
Right.
I only really got into being annoyed with bad research during the plague when there was this wretched paper some months back that was published about it was that basically they were looking at pulse oximetry values that were due to masking something in children. And at the time, I was building pulse oximeters all day. And my whole first postdoctoral fellowship was on cardiorespiratory interaction. And I've thought a very, very long time. And it's also the primary driver of what happens to how ECGs change over time, because you have respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So I've spent many, many years thinking about respiratory physiology. And when that happened, that was really the first point in time where I got involved in any. I was just watching other people have opinions and trying to figure out who was and wasn't full of shit, and not doing an amazing job with it. Yeah? But it was only responsible to open my damn mouth when something turned up where I was certain that it was problematic, and also certain that I understood what I was talking about. There has been digital space has an amazing ability to turn people into children. Right. And there are an awful lot of people who would trade their mother's life for slightly more attention. And this basically they're children, and sometimes they're children with PhDs and MDs who think that if there is a topic that is available into which I can insert myself, it is advantageous for me to have an opinion, even when they don't have the first goddamn idea a lot of the time what they're talking about.
Right. How do we know that that is not what?
Yeah.
That how do you know that the void that existed? Because there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Why do you have so much faith in the public health establishment that ultimately had to be the ones to make the decision, because that's how our society is? We have to have public health to make a decision about stuff. And so why is it that their decisions to close schools, their decisions to shutter business, that they're clearly making those, to me, I'm going to put my bias in, they're clearly making those decisions not based on some granular whatnot, and not but they're making it
the information that you'd be talking about that would be a component to that did not exist at the time.
Right. So why aren't they? How do we decide exactly? You just said, how do we figure out who's full of shit or not? And if you just come out and because you're from some dean of public health that say, I'm not going to name a school, someplace on the East Coast or West Coast, you come out and say, this is what we must do. What the heck? Like, why should we listen to them, James? Let me give you one little anecdote. Sorry, king of these long-winded things, and I ask you something. But I was fascinated, all right, to watch a dean of a school, highly estimable school, very well-known guy. He's written many books, etc. And he described how he made a trip from the West Coast to see his aging grandfather in some other place, and he used data. He used data on a number of cases in his place, number of cases there. He came up with some risk of, and I think he even put it out. He tweeted about it, because that's what MD PhDs do these days. They tweet out about how they. And so he made this whole thing, and I could not help but think that I guarantee if like some common man schlep decided to go from here to, I don't know, Wisconsin, to see his aging dad who's dying of cancer, are we really gonna? I guarantee you there would be a lot of opprobrium that he would get, because he did that and he wasn't, and the case rates in each place wasn't appropriate enough. It's like they're basically making the rules as they go along, and oh, by the way, it seems to fit with their values. So why don't we call all of them, and anyone who had strong opinions based on what you should do, you, James, I mean, anyone who has a strong opinion what James Heathers should wear when he goes to the airport in terms of a mask, they're full of shit, because James Heathers can look at the data and can think about, how many people are there and blah, blah, blah. That person has little relevance to what you're doing, and should have little relevance to what you're doing.
Well, yeah, you'd sincerely hope so. It is very difficult, especially when you are a critic of establishment ideology, basically, and of, I suppose, the long run consequences of how decisions are made about how we organize the life and times of how we establish an empirical understanding of the world. Questions like this become really, really hard. And I have my own biases that I default to the same as everyone else. Like, why should we take them seriously? Do you know what I come back to? That a lot of the time, the truth is boring. A lot of the time, we have conservative defaults that result from how we organize broad swathes of human life in terms of how we do risk management and risk assessment, etc. And we default to a conservative position on that because, in general, the truth is boring. In general, the observations that we didn't have that managed to cut through the noise and really make a difference, like genuine contrarianism, a lot of the time, is usually, far from always, but usually, more of a product of how contrarians wish to be seen than it is a product of replacing established wisdom, even if that wisdom is empty. Right?
I think you make a very good point, James. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go on.
You make a case.
It's almost impossible to answer, right. So I'm happy to be interrupted.
So it goes along with the attitude that there's a movement that calls itself medical conservatism. Essentially, it's an attitude where all the hype is more often than not going to be wrong if analyzed, rationally and calmly and so forth. And also, I want to agree with you with what you mentioned, your attitude of, being quiet and not commenting during a period of time during the pandemic. So I think, to go back to ivermectin, I think the problem, Anish, is the reason I became disinterested. So ivermectin, I thought, how I'll give you my personal journey. At some point I came across, there was a quasi-natural experiment in France. There was a nursing home early in the pandemic I don't know if you're aware of that data, James, where
Rings a bell, but
they
tell me again.
treated the entire nursing home for scabies with ivermectin, and it was back in March of 2020, and they had very few cases of COVID compared to matched, however you want to do it, matched nursing homes elsewhere in France at the same period of time, and they published this. So I thought, that's interesting. That sort of piqued my interest, and then on that basis, I thought, well, then why not, right? We're in April, May, June of 2020. People will use ivermectin. Why not? I mean, I think it's reasonable. There was nothing else. The vaccines were not around. All that stuff was reasonable to use. But then what dissuaded me were two things. One is experiences of colleagues in India who have used it on a much larger scale than I have, and didn't find a major effect. I mean, they were kind of skeptical. Number one. And number two is those guys, those critical care doctors that Anish mentioned, that group that has been pushing ivermectin very, very strongly. The problem was that their emphasis, it was how strong their opinion about ivermectin is compared to the available data. So it's this delta between the emphasis of the opinion, the strength of the opinion, and the available evidence that made me suspicious that this, that sort of, I started, moving away from, being on board with on the ivermectin train. And the same, I think, can be said for the other side, for, the people who, so you have, I think, a very reasonable opinion about masks, very well-fitting masks put carefully on an adult who can keep them on. I think it makes
that's the only kind I own.
Right. So it makes it right. But then when I think Rochelle Walensky, the head of CDC, just a few days ago said masks in school, it reduces transmission by 80%. She made a wild claim about the effectiveness of masks, because of course masks in schools means little things that fly off the minute the kids goes in school. So it's always, we have to judge.
Some kids can't manage shoes.
Right, correct. So short of having good data, which we never have, or good analysis of data, which you provide, short of that, there's a value to calibrating, right? I mean, judging an opinion and how it whether it matches the quality of the evidence that's there, and that goes on both sides. So you can have.
Yep.
On the pro sort of a current establishment public health authority side, and maybe on the other side that denigrates the value of the vaccine, in broad ways, and or vaunts COVID. I mean, ivermectin and all kind of alternative.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point.
Let me add something. I said before, it's sort of founding principle that the truth is boring. I'd say the truth is usually boring. Here is another one that probably I imagine would meet with some approval from the both of you. We'll have a better idea of what you think now. Here it is. If you come out and you say, without on the basis of any evidence, because you need to make a statement, because you're forced to occupy a position, because you are a body with statutory authority to develop that position and tell people. If you put false values on top of something, if you present evidence as being stronger than it is, because you feel like it's your job to say something authoritative, and then you make that more detailed than it has to be on the basis of the best available evidence, that kind of paternalistic bullshit where you dress something up with data that isn't there does not work in the long run. Because someone will find out, and then you will undermine your authority. Now, people are going to talk shit about you anyway, but if you're giving them the ammunition to be perfectly correct in the fact that you do not have the basis to be able to make a certain kind of decision, it's very short-term thinking. You're thinking, I need people to form this opinion within the next 2 days, and I've got to shore it up with numbers. There's plenty of bullshit artists all over the world who love to shore things up with numbers because they help. Because they present a quantitative perspective on something. It implies that there's been measurement. When you do that inaccurately, or we basically say, well, a message that we essentially agree with is being promulgated elsewhere on the basis of data that we don't really have.
Yeah.
And I understand their position, or they're trying to do the right thing, or, well, it doesn't really support it, but it gets to the conclusion that we want anyway. The moment you start thinking like that, you are a fucking propagandist, and clever people who do not agree with you will pry that out of your argument with a pair of needle-nose pliers, and then they'll wave it around like they pulled it out of your chest and say, I told you we couldn't trust them. You never give people, especially when you're trying to manage a position in public, you never give people an excuse to be able to say they got to a position that they alleged to be evidence-based when the evidence didn't exist. And so it's not just a matter of being conservative, it's a matter of like, you have to be able to shore that shit up. If you're not sure, if you say, if it's a matter of like 80, but I've never seen a figure that said that something was the 80% effective. I mean, what does that even mean in context? It seems like two numbers that are put into place to be able, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, there's some great research on it, but if there is, I haven't seen it, right?
There's a mannequin that didn't get sick.
Okay.
80% reduction in mannequin infections.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, save the plastic boys, up the plastic army. Yes, absolutely. This is something that's happened a lot of the time in a lot of different work. You get to the point where you're forced to be able to be authoritative, and just because you want it to be easier, but James, basically, you want the message to be more effective.
Who are the people though that are sitting in society that are forced to be authoritative about certain edicts? Right? It is literally the public health institutions that are surrounding us now, because they were faced with this once in a lifetime threat.
I told you I don't envy their job at all. Fuck
right.
That.
And so what they ended up doing is they ended up doing exactly what you are talking about. And I think that's why your Atlantic piece was so wonderful, because your Atlantic piece, you could have used the Atlantic piece as an idea just to slam some, fringe folks who think, ivermectin will make you live to 200.
I'm not. It's just the point of anyone who writes something like the piece that you read, and the whole idea is, do you know something? You're wrong, and I'm right. Ha ha. Anything where the thesis of a piece, I am not interested in writing it. I'm not interested in reading it by someone else. Where is it from, and what does it consist of? What is the environment that it came out of? Why has this been so sticky and so self-sustaining? Right. And if you're up to your ears with it, people like harassing the staff at work, I had people writing me shitty emails and shitty Twitter DMs and the rest of it. And the vast majority of the time, they're not calling me a demon, although that did happen once. It was very funny. The vast majority of the time, they're not doing that. They have poorly organized pieces of evidence that they think that matters, and generally they're throwing them at me.
Right.
And a lot of the time, those are actual, honest to God, either they're scientific papers or they think they are, or they're scientific analyses and they think they are. Now, a lot of it is crap. Right. But they're not arguing with me on the basis. They're arguing with me on the basis of information that they think they have. They're not calling me a bad person a lot of the time. They're just assembling bad arguments. Right. And that is what got me started on thinking about it from this perspective in the first place. I thought that was really interesting, because I've written things before where all they do is abuse you.
Yeah.
Right? That happened. You remember I wrote the previous thing that I wrote for the Atlantic about microchips. Yeah.
Right? Yes. Yeah,
no one wrote back to say, were you not aware of these advances of miniaturization? Are you not? Because it was literally about microchips. People wrote to me to tell me I was a prick. Right.
But James, what I think the dangers are not the dangers. Clearly exists, as you've outlined, in terms of certain groups that take on a religious, that have a religious, almost a religious approach to what works and what doesn't work. Right? It gets very, very, it gets much more dangerous, honestly. Not when there's a fringe group that believes, X, Y, or Z. It gets way, way, way worse, and that's what I'm worried about. When the CDC, when large public health institutions are doing very similar things. All right. And so, I try, and I'm not as good as you, but I try very hard to limit opinions. Well, I don't do a good job of that at all. So I don't even know why I'm saying it. I should do a better job every time, but for instance, the COVID, the whole, the issue with myocarditis. All right. and what the CDC has done when it comes to trying to present what the risk of myocarditis is related to COVID and related to the vaccine is incredibly interesting. If you delve into that, right, they've effed up the data, they've effed up the denominators to come up with some COVID myocarditis rate that is 16 times the rate of not having COVID. And look, I won't get into it here, but we talked to an infectious disease doc, the head of I think he's the head of infectious disease at Tufts, Cody Meisner, who's also sits on the VRB PAC committee that advises on vaccines. He was one of the 17 votes, right, that resulted in approval of the vaccine. So so I'm some random podcaster sitting in front of an orange screen. He's got some more credentials than I do, and even he said, yeah, Anish, the numbers, I think you're right about that in terms of the CDC numbers probably being, that doesn't sound right. It's probably some model or something like that. Because why is that? Because he hasn't, through the pandemic, he hasn't seen much COVID myocarditis in kids. He's seen vaccine myocarditis, right? So I bring that all up to say that I think you're absolutely correct about what's happening in terms of false data and the problems of it, and how certain fringe groups are hanging on to it and maybe selling snake oil and whatnot. But my goodness, I'm a lot more worried that there's massive public policy decisions being made by folks who sit, who are sitting in the White House or sitting, close to the White House or whatnot. And these are decisions that are far more impactful, and they're using bad data, and they're coming up with, and they're, motivated research, et cetera, to do this. So
yeah, you're allowed to think other problems are more concerning than the problems that I deal with. Most people often do, not usually from that perspective, but more sort of, where are we going drinking this evening? That presents a huge problem, as opposed to what's James worried about today. Look, this is I'm not for this myocarditis thing. Is I only have this comes up so often in my life now. There is only so much time in the day from everyone who is volunteering to get involved in basically trying to have a broader discussion of healthcare policy, which is, like 1,000 times more important than it used to be all of a sudden. And the problem is that we do not have any largesse to get things long run correct. We don't have 2 years to think about whether or not that particular version of an antiretroviral is better than that previous one. We don't get to run long, glorious, slow, well-funded phase 3 trials. Everything is kicking real hard all the time. And while being completely unfamiliar with like the specifics of literature like that, it should be amazing to everyone that opinions on that can differ so much on the basis of this. I've seen an awful lot of discussion of it,
right?
And this is one of those things we were just talking about an hour ago about the role of local knowledge. Without the ability to penetrate something like that, the vast majority of the discussion that's attached to this issue is not by you two. I mean, you go, I'm just a fella at an orange screen. Michelle is just a fella behind a very blurry background that looks a bit prison-y, to be quite honest. You're both cardiologists. So you have several legs up on me on being able to interpret this specific information, right? And the breadth of the discussion is really interesting. In general, I have to, me, data idiot, I have to default to things like, why are so many people who are involved in talking about this issue with local knowledge fighting this hard? In general, like there's an emotional default to this for me, and it's really straightforward. I'm glad they're fighting.
Right.
Right?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think the points are super important. And I think we would all be better served if we commented a lot less and much less definitively when things were incredibly confusing. And certainly, I think Michelle's point is fantastic. When there's a massive delta between what the evidence is suggesting,
Yeah.
and what the opinion is, be very skeptical.
We will
James,
call it Michel's confidence evidence delta, the MCED.
Yeah, we call it the law. Right, the law.
the principle. All right, James, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. It was so great. It's always fun talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on. I know your time is incredibly valuable, and we appreciate the hour and a half that you spent with us.
Yeah, look, it's my pleasure. When I was here last time, what was interesting is, I mean, I've had a lot of people who talk to me about things that I have done previously that have been critical, and the only person who ever pushed back against some of the things, well, I really have wished for a very long time that people would actually push back, because we're not going to have a good discussion if you want me to just reel off all the shit that I wrote. I mean, you could just go read it if you want. All we're doing is wearing down my voice box. But the only people who actually push back and said, well, if we do this, one of the questions that you asked was, are you afraid of undermining the confidence in things that really should have sort of like, if you're undermining the micro confidence of this thing, are you ever worried about the macro confidence, basically? And it's stuck in my head ever since, because it's a very, very good question, right? So it's hard to have discussions like this, but people like me prefer to be pushed, right? And it makes it much easier to do a podcast when I'm not just going to narrate my goddamn life story. And I'm bored of that because I was there when it happened, right? Thank you for opening a discussion where I actually have to use more than 2 neurons to have it. I appreciate that. I'm serious.
No, thank you for coming out of, there's too many echo chambers, there's way too many bubbles, and I really do think most people are very well-meaning, and, once we start attributing good faith, bad faith, we run into all sorts of trouble when we stop talking, so I think it's, yeah, so it's always
the
fun.
MCED is violated, assume good faith.
Sir, great chat.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.